Hello everyone, welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD, and welcome back to the New Music Podcast. Now, the observant among you may have noticed there is someone missing from the picture here, or I guess he's not usually on screen, so missing from the sound. That would be my co-host Micah. Unfortunately, he had a bit of a medical emergency and is still recovering, doing well overall from that incident, but he was in the hospital this last weekend, just still recovering, so he's not going to be on this week's episode. He will likely be giving his thoughts on the albums we cover today in the next episode. I guess stay tuned next week for that. This one's just going to be me rolling off the cuff. We're in a little bit of a turbulent time for the podcast because the week prior, I got super sick over the weekend, had to kind of delay the podcast as a whole. So that's where we're at. I'm going off the dome on 5 albums from the previous week in music, starting with Psykos by Young, Lean, and Bladee.
Seen it all, 10 years, blood, sweat, and love, still standing tall. Twist stands on the edge of a knife.
Young, Lean, and Bladee, in the previous times we've seen them, the many previous times there has been, have proven to be a pretty good combo. And on Psykos, they're heading in a completely different direction. This is pretty uncharted territory for them, at least as far as I've heard from any Drain Gang or affiliated sort of projects. They're dipping straight into the emo rap bag, which is an interesting time to be doing that because we are almost in like a post-emo rap era in that it's not really outdated anymore, but there's not a lot of people doing it anymore. So it's like calling back to a style almost already. I know that was pretty big, mostly in the mid 2010s, so it's not like it was all that long ago, but still, it's kind of a revival thing going on here. Lots of guitar samples, an alternative feel. This is almost as much of a rock album as it is a rap album. Some alternative sounds, some great uses of emo-tinged songwriting and lyricism. There's kind of an overarching air of nihilism almost, I would say. And it does kind of end up shining through on some brighter moments on the record that are a little bit more confident or empowering or just uplifting in general. But for the most part, it stays in a pretty sad bag, which is interesting to see. It's a little bit more grounded in reality and a little bit less ethereal than Drain Gang tends to get. This is something where either you're just going to be into it or you're not, quite frankly. Like, there's just not going to be much of an in-between. If you have some nostalgia for the emo rap sounds of artists like Lil Peep, as well as have been into the drained aesthetic in the past before, then this will absolutely be right up your alley. And I fall into those categories, and guess what? I love this thing. I honestly feel that it's a near perfect album for my personal experience. There's not really much more that I wanted to get out of it that I didn't. And coming in with a track list of only 8 songs and 22 minutes, I believe, is the runtime here, they're keeping it pretty brief. They're coming in, doing this experiment. It pans out well. They don't ruminate on it. They don't overstay their welcome with this. It's just doing it effectively and then heading on out. And would I love to see more? Sure. But that would give more space for misses. And misses, I don't think, are something this album really has. My least favorite track on here ended up being Hanging from the Bridge, just because I felt that it wasn't one of the more significant or individualistically mattering and important songs on the album, I suppose. Other than that, I mean, you know, it's all great. I would listen to that song on its own. Maybe the intro that's focused in spoken word is the only song that I wouldn't revisit in an isolated space. My favorite song on the album ended up being Enemy. That one is such a cathartic, explosive, invigorating moment. It really is the climax of the whole album, and then the final song ends up being kind of the come down of it. This song is just perfect to me. Like, it's such an awesome, explosive moment. But Ghosts was a really close second. Ghosts, to me, really clicked because it does kind of have that vibe of a Lil Peep song that I did really enjoy, and just beyond that, awesome sounding track. But I mean, realistically, I can just go down the list here. The closer that I previously mentioned a little bit of, Things Happen, is another song that I think is pretty much perfect. I mean, you know, I can be here all day. Really, this project is just fucking fantastic. And that's about all I have to say about it. My score on this ended up being a 92%. Again, we don't have averages, so we can't really total everything up this week because Micah's not here, but we'll let that ruminate, and then we'll see what his scores end up being next week. And the next one we have up here is from alternative country folk singer-songwriter Kacey Musgraves, Deeper Well.
Sweet and divine, the perfect design. Can I speak to the architect? When I look at you, I'm always looking through anime eyes.
Kacey Musgraves is an artist that I haven't exactly fully dove into in the way that she's probably deserving of and people would have typically recommended. Her album Golden Hour, I know, has some great tracks on it, at the very least, if it's not good all the way through. I don't think I've really dove into it fully. And then I did hear her previous, I want to say 2022 album, and liked a fair bit of it, but I don't really come back to it all that much. Of what I have heard, Deeper Well is definitely my favorite thing she's put out so far, because while that previous record was good, it did leave me wanting something more, something a little bit more significant to come along, and I didn't end up feeling that at all with this one. I think that it does everything that you would expect it to, really checks all of the boxes and then does some more, because you have a very stripped back, relaxed country, folk, indie, again, kind of using all of those buzzwords for what's basically a person talking about stuff, singing about stuff with a guitar. Not a lot else going on. You have that on a lot of tracks. Okay, there's some pretty simple ones here, and on those simpler tracks, you really see a lot of personality shining through. There's some storytelling here, which does get into a pretty profound bag every once in a while. There's some kind of deep songs on this thing, realistically. But then there are departures and experiments on that said idea. The alternative feel of Cardinal made it one of my favorite tracks on this album. That's a really great way to open the album. And then the magical sound of Jade Green was something I was also really impressed with, especially in that second half of the track where it just kind of gets all psychedelic with it. Some moments that weren't exactly favorites for me, but were songs that I like nonetheless, were also Anime Eyes first, which anime being referenced on this type of album is just not the sort of thing you would expect, but I mean, hey, apparently she's into anime a bit. That's what I'm gonna gather from this song. But the execution of it, it's just kind of funny. It's kind of cute. I don't know what to think of this song, but it's very animated the way that a song called Anime Eyes should be. So I thought that was fun. It's a fun song. And then Lonely Millionaire kind of has this pop or R&B feel to it that I thought was totally unexpected, so that was pretty cool too. Again, not one of my favorite songs here, but a really good sounding one. As far as any other favorites, I would like to shout out The Architect in particular. I think that's the most profound songwriting we get all the way through here, and I think that's a great song. And if I go and dig into the lower moments of this album, the things that I don't necessarily like as much, I end up with songs that are just a little bit more simple and don't do a whole lot. So tracks like Dinner with Friends, Nothing to Be Afraid of, and the title track are the ones that I would point out as just kind of being pretty regular, so they didn't do a lot for me. Overall, I was feeling a 74% on this record. Next up is electronic ambient producer Fortet with his album 3. Now, again, I know this is a little bit of a sin, but I've actually never really checked out Fortet before. I think maybe I've heard some of those Mad Villainy remixes that happen at one point or another, but if I have, that's about it, unless there's some production credits I'm not aware of at some point. And I wouldn't say that this record necessarily made me a fan, but it made me curious to check out more of Fortet's work that's come out in the past, and also curious to see what could be coming next. And the way I phrased that made it kind of sound like I don't like this record, and I do want to be clear that that's not exactly the case at all. I think that this record really did a lot of things right. Of these 8 tracks, I would say about half of them really do a great job of putting me in this intended psychedelic trance sort of thing that I feel like he's going for in creating and producing these ones. It's just the one thing that ended up throwing me off from the other half of the album. You know, I mean, not exactly half, but if we wanted to say 60-40, 70-30, whatever, is that sometimes these songs will be very directly segmented. Either that or some of those songs kind of just feel slapdash, like everything was just thrown at the wall and just gonna see what sticks. 31 Bloom is the particular moment that I would use to illustrate what I'm saying with a song that just kind of sounds all over the place and doesn't really get in its groove fully. However, Storm Crystals actually ended up being my least favorite on the album, just because sometimes instead of just feeling a little all over the place with the actual pacing of the song, what'll happen is that everything kind of builds continuously, or sometimes does have segmented portions, but regardless, makes sense together. But there'll be certain sounds in the mix that are just a little bit harsh or a little bit too loud. The mixing, just at certain moments, just doesn't hit quite right for me. And I mean mixing in the sense of like how loud things are in the mix, not necessarily like how crisp or clear anything is. Pretty much just that. So yeah, I guess that's how I'm feeling about this one. Favorite track ended up being Skater, because it does get into a little bit more of an interesting and experimental bag. This one is incorporating some rock sounds, and that one just feels really significantly steady throughout, so builds in a pretty nice way. But overall, I'm feeling a 67% on this one. All right, and the next and fourth album we have up for this week is ZWAARD, ZWAARD. I'm not sure exactly which way it's meant to be said, by Beans.
Rappers got burned and learned the color of flames. Rappers got burned and learned the color of flames. When I die, burn my ashes and pressing up the vinyl of my latest release so I can die as I live creatively. Y'all ain't touching me, Captain Leprosy. Y'all ain't touching me, Captain Leprosy. Y'all ain't touching me, Captain Leprosy, a dangerous. That Beans kid is so ill that when he walks by, instead of hi, they say get well. Music's musically my meld. That boss cut a breath, bespoke, bistro, no joke, no comedian. Bastion is Kabasa.
I believe it's said both ways throughout the album. I think it's an acronym, but honestly, I don't know. I've really dug into the lyrics a lot on this one, and I don't think there's an explanation anywhere of what that's an acronym for. So that's there as well. This is a pretty obscure artist, a really underground kind of cut. I did end up finding this artist on Bandcamp at one point, and then was just kind of waiting for this album to release because I heard the single of it, which was the first track on this album, and was immediately intrigued. Now, I don't know how Beans has stayed as unknown to the greater internet music listening community as he has, because he has had some pretty notable collaborations in the past. He has worked with LP, Elucid, of course, of Arm & Hammer fame, if you're familiar, as well as Cities of Viv, or Aviv, I'm not exactly sure how to say that either. You know, names that if you're into experimental hip-hop, you definitely know, that have kind of gotten some fame and notoriety on this general area of the internet here that we are existing in. But Beans is pretty much entirely unknown to myself personally, despite having music that goes all the way back to 2002. And with giving a little bit of a shout out here, I hope that any of you will go ahead and check this artist and this album out, because I think this is some pretty fantastic stuff. On a production angle, this is some of the most abstract and creative hip-hop production I've heard in a while. People who are into JPEG Mafia will probably go ahead and appreciate a lot of that here. So if you've liked some of his work in the past, I mean, this is just as unique in its sampling choices, in its strange pacing, and anything like that as a JPEG Mafia album would be. But that's really just me trying to get a grasp at all on what to start with the sound of this album. All of the elements that you're working with are largely the same, given there's samples, synthesizers, drums, so on and so forth, but the actual choice of them and the usage of them is completely different. There's often a very segmented approach between a very simple hook and very wordy, fast, elaborate verses that are extremely verbose and quickly paced that will often be more chaotic and less rhythmic in its actual instrumental qualities. To again go back to that first and opening track that was a single from this album, you can kind of see what I mean just even getting right into the album that early on. With this one, you have this energetic and fast-paced chorus that is only one line but still manages to be catchy. And then in the verses here, you get a lot more chaotic drums on here, just a lot of little like pops and snaps happening, and just wildly layered effects all over it. There's something nostalgic about how especially the instrumental on the hook sounds on this one that does kind of call back to some like 2000s stuff, and it feels like what was previously seen as futuristic, if that makes any sense. And then if you roll down to the next track, this one's even weirder, using some strange and warped vocal samples. If it had a title, the title would probably be something involving a ghost, because that is used in the actual lyrics of it, and it does sound absolutely haunting as well. And oftentimes there will be some big low-end bass sounds used in the mixes here, but I appreciate how much of the actual mix and the sounds used here like live in the high end, the higher frequencies of the mix. There's just such strange little details, and sometimes it just feels completely random. Sometimes things fit in just where they should, but always it's giving you something pretty dynamic. And again, with how weird this is, it shouldn't really feel like it has such defined song structures, but he knows his way around a hook. And again, most of these hooks will be only one line repeated, but in a rhythmic and catchy way that really complements well to his style of rapping on the verses, which are very segmented in phrasing. He's somewhat conversational with the way that he raps. It sounds a little bit more like a spoken word or slam poetry type vibe than how you would expect many rappers, and especially the modern era, to sound. There's moments on this album that sound energetic and really kind of pump you up a little bit, but there's also moments that sound strange and warped and weird and uncomfortable. And Beans as an actual lyricist is also absolutely insane. Track 6 on this album is probably my favorite here just because of how hard it bangs, but the actual hook on this, the line is, "Y'all ain't touching me, I'm Captain Leprosy." Like, that's pretty great. That's pretty great. The verbose approach to writing here is pretty excellent. More lines on here, like the first track has, "Everybody's G.O.D. growing old and dying," is how it's phrased there. "Gravity is your enemy, you just ain't that fly. That's word on Nick Fury's good eye. Mentally, y'all is mayonnaise." This one's pretty wordy, but it's one of my favorites. "My facial expression scrunched up, looking at you like I smelled something bad. Rappers is trash, ain't worth the Coles cash." So yeah, that should kind of give you a good idea about how verbose he is with his rapping and just the strange phrasing and odd references and just about everything you could ask for. As a rapper and a vocalist and everything, he's a presence that it takes some getting used to, but I don't think that that should be a huge barrier for entry to anyone who's already into experimental hip-hop, because if we think about things like Death Grips, especially is what comes to mind right away, that kind of shouty delivery, I mean, you're going to get some different and interesting vocal inflections, maybe some of the yelpier and shoutier moments in Danny Brown's discography even. Anyone who's open and willing to explore a stranger sound of hip-hop should definitely be into this. I absolutely recommend you go ahead and check it out if that is something you're into. This one's a little bit hard for me to score and pick favorites from, partially just because of how it's structured. And there are just some strange like little interlude moments where I'm like, okay, why are we necessarily slapping an instrumental moment here? And sometimes those like really simple hooks do leave me wanting a little bit more, considering how catchy the catchiest moments on this album get. But for the most part, it's a absolutely fantastic listening experience front to back. I definitely recommend this one. My score for it ended up being a 78%, and without these actually having names, naming off favorites and least favorites doesn't necessarily mean a lot to you, more than likely, unless you're really like paying attention to the track list. But the 6th track is probably my favorite, along with the 1st and 14th songs on here. My least favorites would happen to be the 4th, 13th, and 10th tracks on here. So, but everything on here is quite good, so it's not like it's going to be difficult to listen to any of these songs if you're into this sound again. So totally recommend Beans. Go ahead and check out this new album, ZWAARD, and then we're gonna go ahead and move on to the final album for the week, Warp Speed Warriors by Dragonforce. So this album is quite campy. It's got a lot of pop culture references. It's got a lot of bombastic, over-the-top energy. It's kind of just got a whole little nerdy vibe about it overall, but I don't think that really detracts anything from it, considering you decided to go ahead and listen to a Dragonforce album. If you clicked on this album at any point, I don't think that's really taking anything away from it. It's more just a quality of the music at this point. It's a little hard to take seriously, but I don't think you're supposed to take it seriously at all. This thing is just some power metal that's really fun and really upbeat. The only thing that's, I suppose in a way, a compliment and a detriment to the actual music here as well is that if you can give Dragonforce one thing at all, it is that they're consistent. Like, this sounds pretty much exactly like all the other Dragonforce music I've heard in the past, and they are a band that I'm a little bit nostalgic for, especially, of course, for Through the Fire and the Flames, which anyone who played Guitar Hero in the past would absolutely be familiar with. That track holds a special place, and I think they're still kind of chasing the dragon, so to speak, with that one. With that song, that being their biggest hit, that being their most infamous track. The song on here, Pixel Prison, sounds pretty much exactly like it, but not quite as good. And there's other stuff just on here in general that make me feel like they're really just kind of up to the same thing and haven't really tried too much new. That being said, there are some songs on here that are going to be pretty individualistic in their actual approach to the topic. There's the Space Marine song on here, which is absolutely like one of the goofiest songs I've ever heard, but I mean, I don't hate it. It's just a little much to stomach sometimes. But then you have what might be the best song on here, Power of the Triforce, being a Legend of Zelda themed track. So a Legend of Zelda themed power metal song, and it's a vibe. It's a vibe for sure. The other thing that's kind of holding this album back, though, is the mixing on it. Whoever mixed the percussion on this album really did the band dirty, to be honest with you, because Burning Heart could have been the best song on the album because it has this cutaway moment where it gets kind of more spacious. There's an instrumental break, and the way the drums hit on that moment is just not right at all. That one could have been so dynamic and really cool all around, but the thing is, it's just a little flat. Wasn't well taken care of in the post-production sense at all. They're all playing super nicely, and really this thing is like decently structured overall. It has all of the right pieces, But yeah, I mean, there's some polish and some finishing touches that we're certainly missing. If you can get past the campiness, or if you specifically like the campiness of this, then it's probably going to be a pretty enjoyable experience. There's not moments that are like completely without flaws on it. You gotta take it with a grain of salt in a way, but it is a fun album. It's a good listening experience overall. It's a fun one to just turn on just for some good vibes, I guess, overall. And my favorites on here ended up being Doomsday Party, as I mentioned, Power of the Triforce, and then The Killer Queen as well. All of those being pretty standout, notable ones that I think could definitely find their way onto a playlist for me. But then, yeah, my least favorite ones on here, Kingdom of Steel was a really corny moment for the album. It's heading less in the speed and power metal direction and more into an arena rock direction that I thought sounded pretty corny and pretty terrible all around. That was one moment where the corniness of the album really took me out of the experience. I was a little bit worried upon getting to that song that the rest of the album would be like it, or that we would be seeing other songs like it. Thankfully, that's really the only slowdown moment, I guess. But yeah, then Burning Heart ended up being one of my least favorites, and like I said, it could have been my favorite pretty easily if it was just polished up a little nicer. Space Marine Corps, I already mentioned, being a pretty hard to stomach track just in its experiments, I suppose. Its sections with the military chants and so on was just a bit much, I think. Overall, I ended up giving this a 67%. So yeah, like I said before, we'll be following up next episode to kind of get the full averaged out ratings on all of these albums that we talked about here today. I don't really see a need to do a scoreboard top to bottom, of course, given the circumstances. But we'll be back next week here. Again, kind of a lot going on. I am moving at the current moment, so it's going to be a little bit hard to find the time, but I know that we will. I know that we'll be back with you next week here, and I do want to let you know just everything that we're covering right quick before we head on out of here, because the music that's just came out for this week that we will be covering on next week is some pretty significant releases for the year. We have Future and Metro Boomin with We Don't Trust You, of course, going to be one of the biggest moments in rap music for the year, as well as a new album from Adrian Lenker, already seeing a lot of fanfare, I suppose. I think it might be the most beloved album of the year so far in general consensus, so I'm pretty excited to check that one out. Matt Champion of Brockhampton has finally released a solo project. Pretty highly anticipated stuff for me personally, so I'm excited to check that out. And those of you who might have stuck around for the Shakira video, like from the Shakira video, I should say anyways, Shakira has a new album out. Looks like a lot of collaborations on this Shakira album as well, so that'll be interesting. And then Julia Holter also seemed like her album was worth checking out. So that's what we have coming up for the next week. So that's about going to wrap it up for this one, though. And see you next week.